Who will pay for the financial fallout of the coronavirus pandemic? Governments around the world pledged trillions of dollars to try and keep their economies afloat. Will the massive bailouts stop another global financial crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Most economists agree the coronavirus pandemic has pushed the world into recession. Trade and business abruptly stopped when billions of people were told to stay at home. Governments are pledging huge stimulus packages to try and reduce the damage. The European Union has agreed a $590 billion rescue package to prop up the worst-hit economies, such as Spain and Italy. That includes unemployment benefits, loans for small businesses and healthcare services. But EU leaders couldn't agree on how to share the cost of the crisis. The French finance minister is calling this the most important economic plan of the EU's history.
This response contains bold and ambitious proposals that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago. We can all remember the response to the financial crisis of the last decade, when Europe did too little, too late. This time around is different.
Other countries, such as Australia, Britain, China and India, have unveiled multi-billion-dollar rescue packages. And the biggest bailout in US history has been unveiled by Congress, $2.25 trillion. That will cover unemployment benefits, loans and direct payments to every American. The International Monetary Fund says the world is facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression in the 1930s.
The encouraging news is that all governments have sprung into action, and indeed there has been significant coordination. Our fiscal monitor next week will show that countries around the world have taken fiscal actions amounting to some $8 trillion. And in addition, there have been massive monetary measures from the G20 and others.
Let's introduce the panel. In London, Vicky, Pryce, the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic Business and Research. In Stockholm, Sweden, Hosuk Lee-Makiyama, Director at the European Centre for International Political Economy. And also in Britain's capital, Greg Swenson, founding partner at investment banking firm Brigg Macadam. Welcome to you all. Vicky, first of all, this will be a question for all of you. Combined global major international economies putting trillions of dollars into fighting, into trying to recover from the global effects of the coronavirus. Will it be enough to stave off a major global recession or minimise a recession?
The general expectation is that many countries will have to do more, but we've just had, for example, the Fed in the States putting an extra over $2 trillion US dollars in liquidity into the market. So it's obviously been understood that what has been done so far, despite quite a lot of fiscal stimulus, which we've seen in a number of countries, probably isn't going to be enough. But very much is going to depend on how quickly we get out of this. And there are, of course, a number of countries that are already showing some sort of signs that they have an exit strategy. So we might see the beginnings of maybe getting out of this lockdown that so many places are facing right this minute. But it's going to be very tentative. So the likelihood is that governments will have to come back. And if it takes much longer than they anticipated, then with it, of course, with budgets will be going up and deficits will be increasing very significantly. So, and also monetary authorities may have to do more. We just don't know right now, but what they've done so far was an absolute must. And as I said, we may need to do more.
Hosuk, what they've done so far is an absolute must. Is there enough that the global economies have pumped into the system to stave off the worst?
Well, everyone has been engaged in, trying to cater to their own economies, I guess. As we heard, the US package is probably about 10% of its GDP. Perhaps the most impressive package has been coming so far from Japan, which is almost spending a quarter of its GDP and 1/3 of it going to actually small business and households, and spending almost 110% of its annual budget. The real underachiever here in this context is probably Europe, where we have so far only seen $500 billion committed on a European level. And well, we have countries like Germany who has committed about 750 billion, but overall it is quite underwhelming, and we have still a very bumpy road ahead under the second quarter.
OK, we'll come back to Europe in a second, but globally, Greg, do you think overall we're going to stave off a severe global recession?
Well, I'm not sure that that's even possible, no matter how much money is thrown at this thing, from central banks as well as from governments. So I think the issue is, how bad and how quickly can we get out of this? And that's all going to be driven, as I think we'd all agree, by the progress in fighting the coronavirus and increasing the testing that's necessary in order to flip the switch on these economies. It won't be a V-shaped. It's going to be a bumpy road. But I think the sooner that we can get back to work, then the less money that will be required from governments in the form of stimulus.
And Vicky, do you think that Europe, the European Union, Eurozone countries are, if you like, letting the side down on this, and there'll be pressure on them to come up with much more?
Well, as we heard, some countries are doing quite a lot. But for example, Germany. Others can't really afford to do that. That includes Italy, Greece, possibly also Spain. So what we have is a bit of an unequal reaction to this. So all the eyes were on what the Eurozone might do, what the Eurogroup might do, what the EU might do more generally. So what we have so far is the European Central Bank has stepped in quite significantly with an extra promise to purchase securities worth about 750 billion over the next year. What they're going to do, of course, is also buy Greek bonds for a change. So at least it allows governments in Italy, Greece, etc., to themselves go out and borrow more and have access to the capital market. So that's good news. But in terms of sharing the burden a little bit more equally, what we got from the European Union in terms of the latest package of 500 billion euros or thereabouts, there's been a certain amount of direct support to countries through the lending facility, mainly using the ESM, which is basically the facility that was created after the financial crisis. This is a loan which has no conditions, even though some northern countries wanted to have those conditions. Well, that's good news. That's about 250 billion over that 500. We have some help for the unemployed in the sense of encouraging firms to keep their workers on their books, about 100 billion of that. And we have extra money coming to firms via guarantees from the European Investment Bank. All this is quite good news, but it is about a third of what the European Central Bank has said we needed in terms of fiscal stimulus across the EU. That's why I said at the beginning we might need a little bit more. We haven't finished, I think, there. We don't have any serious shared risk-taking in the form of Corona bonds or Euro bonds that many countries wanted. So yes, it is quite limited at present, and quite a lot of countries are going to end up having borrowed a lot more. And the worry is what's going to happen when we come out of it, assuming we do in a reasonable way, in terms of needing to retrench again. So we had this terrible period of austerity over the last 10 years, and are we going to see it again?
Hosuk, that is my next question. How are we going to pay for this? Who is going to pay for this? For the layman, these eye-watering amounts of money have to come from somewhere. Who's coughing up?
Well, indeed. So far, we are seeing a repeat of the discord we saw during the Euro crisis, which basically means that everybody pays for themselves. As we heard, there are no joint Corona bonds, there are no mutualization of debt. And in the northern countries, I think the population as well as the political leadership remember very clearly that when they created the euro, that there was not going to be a transfer union. There was not going to be the massive savings in the north and the huge debt in the south, and the money would basically move from north to south. That was not supposed to happen. And so, in a word, I mean, I don't necessarily sympathize with that point of view, but there is a very good point, which is that Spain and Italy could easily issue bonds that European Central Bank could simply buy. In other words, the mutualization and the joint bonds are more of a political symbol, which could be very important for calming down the market. But in other words, it doesn't actually add anything in terms of what we can do in terms of fiscal terms. And one thing that is also very clear, which is that if you look at the north, which is basically Netherlands and Germany at this stage, are represented by the same people who negotiated during the Euro crisis. We are looking at the Prime Minister Mark Rutte of Netherlands, and we are looking at Angela Merkel. She's probably going to still be here by the time I'm dead. But whereas on the southern side, we have people like Macron, Spain, and Prime Minister Sanchez in Spain, and also Conte in Italy, they're all newcomers. And another factor that I don't think we should forget about is the fact that President Obama is no longer here, which means that United States played a pivotal role in forging a compromise amongst the EU countries, and that mechanism, that power is no longer here.
Greg, we know about the grumbling from northern European countries unwilling to what they describe as subsidise southern European members. But are we going to head back to austerity? And what would that austerity be? Would it be cuts to public services and funding, or are we going to see tax rises instead this time round?
Well, it's probably going to be a combination of both, although I'm not sure how much more you can raise taxes in a place like Italy. What they've been doing for the last 10 years, hasn't really worked in terms of long-term planning or a long-term solution. I mean, Italy's got debt to GDP is at 135%. The Spanish debt to GDP is 98%. These countries don't really have the ability to issue very much more debt. I mean, it's a good point. You could just issue bonds from those countries and have the ECB purchase them. So there'd be, indirectly funding from basically a transfer payment from the northern countries to the southern countries. But, there's a long history of this north-south divide. And as your other guests indicated, it's a lot of, it's political and psychological, not just purely economic. You look at the pollster, Renato Mannheimer came out last week and said 70% of Italians think that Germany's trying to strangle the Italian economy. And only 16% of those polled disagreed with that statement. So, look, Giuseppe Conte can say all he wants about, the potential of the EU failing if they don't issue these Euro bonds. But there's real opposition to that in the north, not just in Germany and the Netherlands, but in Austria and Finland as well. And so I think they're in a really tough situation. They're either going to have to issue these bonds and sort of, break the rules that they put in place when they put the EU together, or face, a real challenge in keeping the EU together. I think it's going to be a really difficult few weeks in addressing this.
Vicky, we've had an almost abrupt end to commercial activity almost everywhere in the world. Consumer spending is about 2/3 of economic activity worldwide. How long would it take for that to begin to recover?
The problem is that in the process of cutting down and shutting, in fact, both supply and demand, with all these measures in order to control the virus, we're also reducing real incomes very significantly. So GDP will be falling. The ability of consumers to then, after having lost a lot of them their jobs and having reductions in their salaries, those who remain in employment, quite a lot of them, they won't have the purchasing power there to come back and demand all the things that perhaps they weren't able to get while they were on the lockdown. But there will be a recovery nevertheless, but how fast that recovery will depend hugely on whether the consumer then feels quite optimistic about employment issues, whether they think that the health situation really has improved so they can go back to work and they feel safe for themselves and their families. It's going to take quite some time. So we're not going to have the type of sort of impact that perhaps the lowering of interest rates back at the time of the financial crisis and the extra liquidity that was given to individuals and firms had then repeat itself now. It's going to be a much longer process, but a recovery there will be. But getting back to the types of levels we were at before, remember countries like Italy, in terms of per capita GDP, are still below in real terms where they were before the financial crisis. And even in the UK, we've only just got back in terms of hourly wages in real terms, been where they were before the financial crisis here too. So it is going to be a long process, unfortunately, and therefore the government will have to be involved in all this. And those deficits will be quite high and those debts will increase. At some point, we'll have to do something about them. Either we ignore everything that the central bank has bought in terms of bonds in the market, in the secondary market, and writes them off, or something else will need to give, because those levels of debt are simply not sustainable for the longer term if you want growth again to recover.
Hosuk, the direct intervention that governments have taken in supporting salaries, subsidising salaries or sending people cash payments, will that encourage people to continue spending, you think, and minimise the effect of a recession?
Well, I mean, as we heard before, it's actually quite refreshing from hearing from my fellow panelists, because economists usually say that, we are in uncharted territories. It's actually quite refreshing for three of us that admit that we don't know. But the general rule of thumb is that, well, for every week of shutdown of the scale that we've seen, we lose about 1% of GDP. Now, as we were saying before, we are looking at quite a number of events in the second quarter, and possibly in the third, will basically make the stimulus package we are discussing now something of a history. We are looking already at the second and perhaps a third wave of infection coming into places like Singapore and Japan, which will spread further. We are also looking at a collapse of the international trade. WTO issued a report saying that actually the global trade, which has just recovered after the 2010 crisis, it might drop as much as 1/3, which will be unprecedented, and which is also a scale of a global war. And now, I mean, if you look at economies like, for example, Germany and France, actually, half of the GDP in Germany come actually from export. If that market collapses, it basically means that it doesn't really matter what you do to support your salaries, because in the end, the half of your GDP will be gone because the customer is gone. And then we have also much more long-term speculation that we need to take into account, because there's no doubt, for example, the first country to come out of the tunnel will be probably China. And on one hand, China will be forced to reform into building some form of social security network. But on the other hand, extremely export-dependent economies like Europe, but also to a certain extent, U.S. financial institutions who are really depending on investment in China, will see that they will be more dependent on China than ever before. We are already seeing tendency towards this. For example, if you look at the business data, which seem to suggest that China is currently sucking up quite a lot of foreign direct investment, as well as production capacities that actually left China. There's now a reversal of a trend that started with the trade wars now, with the quite a lot of capital and production capacity moving back to China, because that's probably where you want to be in a global pandemic.
And Greg, many Americans will be getting checks of up to $1,200. Employment benefits have been extended and enhanced. That's immediate cash. Is that, you think, the best way to keep an economy like the US ticking over at least?
Well, I mean, historically, and I would say, theoretically or philosophically, absolutely not. Those things never work. They're basically short-term gimmicks. They tried that. George Bush tried that in 2002 with a $600 called a tax refund, but it was basically a transfer payment. They did it again with the Democrats in 2006. And look, it never works. However, there has to be an exception in this case, because the government has, in fact, shut down the economy. So I think it's absolutely critical that they get money into the hands of the people that need it right away and immediately. So it's not designed to be a stimulus. It's not a stimulus. It's a relief, really. It's basically a relief package. And I think that's important to do because of the government's role in this. However, the sooner we can step back from that and get people back to work, let the free markets work, the sooner we do that, the better in terms of the recovery. So, again, historically, these short-term gimmicks don't work. It basically is a transfer payment, and it doesn't really stimulate the economy. I think the best way to stimulate is to deregulate and reduce the taxation burden on workers. And so, look, I think it was a near-term relief that was important, and it was the right thing to do. But for sure, it's not really a stimulus to the economy.
Vicky, I just want to ask you about something you touched on in your last answer. What if governments don't repay all this money that they're printing? What if the central banks buy their own government bonds? Why not repay it? Why not just put it off to the next generation and the next generation write it off? Could that be possible?
It is possible. I mean, remember, of course, that everyone borrowed a lot, and certainly the UK did, had a huge debt to GDP ratio after the Second World War, and we want to just stop paying it, basically. So you can extend, I mean, we're borrowing very cheaply. You can extend the repayment periods possibly, so a lot of restructuring might take place. But otherwise, yes, I'm afraid you may have to just write it off. And the central banks may just have to start again, because, of course, their balance sheets will increase very significantly because of all the operations they're doing right now. But pushing it into the longer term may well be what they decide to do on much better terms, if you like. But if you borrow right now, if you look at what's going on, whether it's here or elsewhere in terms of developed nations, the rates that are being paid for, the yields on, let's say, 10-year bonds right now that the UK can borrow, are very low. They are below 0.5 percent. So 0.5. So very, very low rates. And even when you look at 30-year bonds, we can borrow here at 0.75 percent. So way below 1%. So we can do it. You can probably, pay, repay the interest over a period of time, very low, and you don't have to repay the actual bond for ages. You can survive, but not many countries across the world will be able to do that. And I worry a little bit about the Southern European countries. I also worry about the developing world, where I'm suspecting we're going to see some defaults at some point. And the International Monetary Fund is already getting geared up to deal with that by being prepared to put a lot more money into those countries and also looking at their debt situation. I'm suspecting that many countries will fall by the wayside from that point of view, and they have to start again. So yes, we'll have to really look at the whole debt situation afresh. But for the moment, I think what we have to focus on is on getting to the next phase, at least, where growth can start again.
Hosuk, do you think perhaps more developed economies could get away with not repaying the money they're printing?
Well, that's called defaulting, is it? No. I think another popular phrase that economists like to say nowadays, that we are all Japanese now, which basically means that we are looking at significantly larger government debt in conjunction with relatively abysmal growth rate. And actually, the only country that's grown out of that is Japan, who has basically under Prime Minister Prime Minister Abe has restored some of the faith in the economy, and also the growth of the and the market growth and the corporate profits. But I think Europe definitely is looking at that scenario even to begin with. If that was the baseline, I can really see that we are looking at a significant increase of debt.
And Greg, all the quantitative easing, the money printing that there was after the financial crisis didn't lead to skyrocketing inflation that people were scared of then. So why should we worry now about creating all this debt?
No, it's a great point. I think a lot of us were concerned about inflation and some of the unintended consequences of these central banks levering up. And, you saw the ECB and the Fed at basically at 25% of GDP in terms of their balance sheet. So look, I think it's something that we have to consider. I think we shouldn't ignore it, because if there is some inflationary pressures and interest rates go up, it's going to be really difficult for economies to pay back their debts, especially in developing countries. You've already seen the African finance ministers get together last week and decide to stop interest payments on many of the debt instruments. It's something that we have to consider. So hopefully we make all of these government measures short-term in nature, so that the balance sheets don't blow up too much.
Well, unfortunately, we're already out of time and looking forward to the next crisis, it seems. But for the moment, I'd like to say thanks very much to all our guests, Vicky Pryce, Hosuk Lee-Makiyama and Greg Swenson. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.